Good evening, everyone. Welcome again. Thank you for the marathon of listening and gathering. I'm Paul Ha, and I'm the director of the List Visual Arts Center. And welcome to the keynote portion of the 2025 Max Wasserman Forum. I just want to thank everyone for being here, especially those who are out of town. And I want to thank all the panelists and the moderators for your participation in the three incredible panels that we witnessed this morning, today. The List Visual Arts Center, I want to thank Sarah Montross, Adam Cahill, Nita Senecrot, Associate Professor here at MIT, Lan Toison, Janelle Knox-Hayes, Lee Pivnik, Stephanie Hessler, Jen De Los Reyes, Shahar Kawazmi, Amy Balkin, Beatrice Glow, Michael Wang, and Torkwase for being here today and giving us a wonderful, wonderful day. The Wasserman Forum for Contemporary Art was established in memory of Max Wasserman, MIT class of 1935. And he was one of the members of the founders of the Council for the Arts here at MIT. The public forum was generously endowed by the late Gene Wasserman, who had the vision of a forum where renowned scholars, artists, and those who are significantly adding to contemporary art gather like we have gathered here today, and to have a robust discussion on a significant topic. Max and Gene were active collectors of contemporary art, especially interested in the art of now. As a member of the Council for the Arts, Max played a significant role in commissioning Alexander Calder's The Big Sale, the first major public art at MIT. And with that commission in 1968, MIT was inspired to create the Percent for Art program, and it still goes very strong today. Gene was a scholar and of contemporary art in addition to being a collector, and in 1966, in the Hayden Gallery, which would later become the List Visual Arts Center, an exhibition of 74 objects from their collection were presented. Some of the artists that were in that exhibition were Harry Bertoia, Marcel Duchamp, Giacometti, Matisse, Rauschenberg, and 3 bronzes by Henry Moore. In a 1993 interview with Robert F. Brown for the Smithsonian Archive of American Art, Gene recalled, "I have instituted an annual forum in contemporary art in memory of Max, which I feel is a very appropriate way to remember him, because he was not only interested in contemporary art, but also very interested in MIT. Some of the recent Wasserman Forum topics includes altered access, to discuss disability discourse within the arts and museum institutions, and future genders, to critically think and reimagine how we think about experience and represent gender. Today, I would also like to recognize Peter Wasserman, Max and Gene's son, along with his wife, Alberta Gershel, who could not be with us here today, and Gene's grandson, David Wasserman, and his partner, Kanika, who's with us here today. So thank you for being here. It is evident to me that there now is a need of collective gathering and creating some form of collective action. We are grateful for Jean Wasserman and her vision that gave us a reason to gather here today. Putting on an event like this takes many people and effort, and I would like to thank all my colleagues here at the List Center, and I would like to especially thank Emily Garner, List Senior Manager, Campus and Public Programs, and Cassidy Westjohn, Program Coordinator. Thank you for the enormous work that you had to do to pull this together. Cookies to follow. And now I would like to bring up Emily Garner, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Torkwase Dyson.
Thank you, Paul. That was a very generous introduction, and I appreciate everyone for being here again today. As I said, I'm Emily Garner, and I was able to have the great pleasure to organize this year's forum, and we've been here all today, and it's really my great pleasure to obviously work with my colleagues, but also the artists and the scholars that have been here all afternoon and joined us for dinner last night, getting to know each other and sharing all their expertise on the panel and their generosity that did that. And It's really been a rich and thought-provoking day, and something I've just been so excited about thinking about since like maybe last July, and just seeing where this like, all comes together. So tonight we'll be concluding this forum, as you know, with our featured keynote speaker, and then inviting you all upstairs for a closing reception to hopefully that you can share in the celebration of this day. So renowned artist Torkwase Dyson will deliver tonight's keynote lecture, offering a powerful perspective on the intersections of ecology, infrastructure, and Black spatial liberation strategies. Dyson's work explores how space is perceived and negotiated, particularly by Black and Brown communities, and examines the relationship between art, environmental justice, and the climate crisis. Dyson has had solo exhibitions and installations at the Colby College Museum of Art, Waterville, Maine, Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in Fine Arts, Chicago, Hall Art Foundation, Kunstmuseum Schloss Dernberg in Germany, the Scoville Center for Environmental Education in Philadelphia, among many others and abroad. And she's also participated in many group exhibitions at the Smithsonian across New York and Museum of Modern Art. So with that, I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Torkwase to the stage.
Thank you so much for having me. I know it took a lot to get me here, so thank you to the team. What I would like to share today is I'll start with a group of poems. And these poems I've been working on for a few years now. And I'll go through a group of paintings and then sort of talk about my process. Talk about my process along the way. So I realized that, in a state of unkeeping, I'm living, like all of us, in mourning that fluctuates in scale depending on what I see, what I witness, what I hear. And this fluctuation of scale inside of mourning, I think, is minuscule in relation to the catastrophes that are ongoing. So I'm interested now in thinking about mourning at different scales, and I've always been interested in ideas of the politic of distance. So I approached this conversation and this talk in relation to the poetry because it's the way in which I express these larger things at the smallest scale possible in the studio. So these paintings I'll start with are the Bird and Lava series, and they're much about tension, of course, of environment, time, thinking about weightlessness, and thinking about not the bird or the lava, but the conversation, the tension in between. So a lot of the works you'll hear me speak to today grapple with these sort of environmental histories of time, space, and distance, but also sort of deep internal ancestorship that I'm also trying to grapple with as we live day to day in a transhistorical space. I'll begin. Who are you after swallowing the ocean and all of its light? An enclosure of slow violence, a chamber of waves and black clouds. You swallowed the triangle, the distance, and the unknown. The howling light years are in your body now, echoes of sorrow and steel, adhering to each blood vessel. An intermolecular force of blue. Your arms are a blur of ships. You try holding emancipation close to your damp chest. No time for drowning, you live on, with the dampness of the ocean, with dripping spacious hands and brutal horizons, soaked in discontinuous blackness. You can now spit light. This is where the glory is, the ongoing. The deep swallow changed you, your old self attired inside your new self. breathing in new liquid belonging. Now you can lift your fingers. You take that finger and make a mark, a dig, a scratch. You draw hauntology, a multiscalar condition with the imperceptible fluid. Your new self, all changed by heat and chance, a new demography, a new watercolor. I'm sorry, can we turn the lights down anymore? Is that possible? That's perfect, thank you. I made this work during COVID. The previous works, in size, they're 4x6. And what I was sort of grappling with during COVID was being both on the inside and on the outside, trying to facilitate what it meant to stop moving globally. So I was learning about geographies far from me, and normally I do not take on projects where I don't embody the site specificity in person. I usually don't necessarily address geographies that I don't have an immersive experience with. But this work was different. I was invited to participate in the Shanghai Biennial. And I had never, of course, visited the geography, was really interested in how this translation of infrastructure and unkeeping grounds, building new cities off of old land masses and building spaces off of debris. It felt very much about a kind of ancestorship that was coming and going, and these sort of fossilizing time. It was really interesting to imagine myself of a place and in a place while I was tucked inside my home. So I allowed this sort of invitation to the Shanghai Biennial to sort of allow ancestors from here and there to sort of fossilize inside me as much as possible. And I came up with this sort of condition of force and understanding how different kinds of violences happen over time. So I wrote this piece in relationship to this work and then inviting the different kinds of ancestors inside my mind, those I've known, those I have not known. Okay, this is called The Bad Ancestors. The bad ancestors are welcome here. The brutal ones, the unruly ones, the burn it down ones, the beyond ones. This painting is a reception for them, a salute to the unfavorable, a greeting for the intolerable, to ash and dust, to surface to edge. I open space for the forge. I open space for the forbidden. This painting is made of haunted air, of death and quiet eyes. The gaze expels and disavows. This is disobedience. Terrains of power from here, refusal hails from the sky. A cunning downpour. A new distance arrives. The canvas is now a black hole, where the horizon is blood red, where all lines are for madness, exhausting shape and distance. The expanse is yours, my arms all possibility. These marks are not made for the kind parts of you. They are for your riot. They are for an uncomposed thunder. Yellow is not the breach. I scrape, I pound, I flourish. My palms drenched in ink. I am a wild one. Every glimmering touch and open form. This bolt of light is for the disagreeable. For every liberated lumen, at every scale, I make space for you. This piece is 16 feet by 8 feet. Eventually, this painting I made maybe about 6 months ago. So eventually I began to really distill what it meant to think about ideas of horizon, oceans, into this space of sound and music. And in this distillation, the pieces and the fragments from older paintings made it inside these new paintings. However, in this sort of, meditation space of crawling through these times, sometimes, and, being a witness to all of these sort of deplorable conditions, and painting as a field itself. So I wanted to take on ideas of color in the history of painting and in my work. So I started taking on this idea of this sort of moment of yellow. And yellow appears in my work in these moments of both recognition of ancestorship in space, but also in these new works, unlike the old works, I started to think about what yellow was to me. And I thought it was something, and now it's something else. So I'll read this poem. I thought yellow was a color. I thought yellow was a color. Yellow is not a color. It's an envelope, a stone, a marketplace, a fog, an enclosure of eternal space. It is the free fall of the howl. I spin it for clemency, but it brought the heat of time and liquid throughways. It's a space where the drowned lived. It's a space of force and black sense. What is the nature of space inside yellow, where blackness is infinity large? A form is a boundless expanse of probability, a mark, a line, a leap, a sight. And yellow space has everything to do with scale, inside a drop of cadmium. I sleep in my grandmother's south side hands, all together. I can walk mountains or sit on the rim of Alice's harp, hand to hand, heart to heart. Yellow brings distance. This painting will live beyond me. When I think about these sort of moments of collapse between the deluge of the paint going on to the canvas, all of the canvases start on the floor. And on the floor, they begin of this, these sort of white gessoed surfaces. But as I add the washes upon washes upon washes, this for me is an act of meditation. And I look at these paintings as the washes and as the ground, like this is the beginning, right? And in that beginning, I am very mindful of the way water evaporates, the way water and the temperature in the studio performs a sort of foundation. So I'm interested in this sort of indeterminacy, and I'll speak more about indeterminacy later. But the way in which this sort of new indeterminacy got built in the studio is painting upon painting upon painting. And this moment of this time of indeterminacy gets even thicker the more time I spend drenching these paintings over and over and over again. And I'll give you a little bit of context. This is 5 feet in diameter. So as I think about this dripping, and this is 9 by 12 inches, and soaking, what happens is after a while, the soaking, the dripping, the meditation has formed in my practice, I needed a moment of syncopation. And just like the environments that I am both in kin with and in memory with, some of it starts in Mississippi, some of it starts in Chicago, some of it starts on plantations, some of it starts in the segregated South. I needed a mark. Right? I needed something to sort of ground this indeterminacy in a note. So I began to think about these paintings as moments of time and distance, but also this very intentional space between movement in our space or my space, the viewer space, and the space of an infinity or an unknown. And this tension sort of builds. So the conversation, again, between the bird and the lava is always present in the work throughout different series of paintings. So eventually, when I made these smaller works and I thought about them as tuning and marking, I began to bring a sort of landscape and a different horizon in, and thinking about building these both in these sort of improvisational ways and thinking about the memory of burying my body and living on these plantations year after year, and the meditations that come with them really slows down the mark. So this is acrylic on canvas, and this particular black line across is a really sort of liquid charcoal that I've just started using in the work, and that charcoal sits on top of graphite. So building these both marks that are didactic, these moments that are in our space, and in the sort of distant space, foreground, middle ground, background, what I found is that not only are these landscapes, but they're also musical notes. So how do these things sort of fluctuate? And at each turn in my practice, these tensions sort of come into the work. So in these works, these sort of notes, these moments, I'll call them notes in the field. I began to think about Toni Morrison's Beloved and thinking about the moment Baby Suggs creates in this space and creates this moment of the clearing. Now the clearing in relationship to both the transatlantic slave trade, the chattel slavery, in this moment where a leader in the community calls people in into a sermon-like space. And then that sermon, what is really interested to me and how it translates into the work is this idea of state change. So I created a foundation in the work, unbeknownst to me, this sort of liquid pouring on the canvases. I was building an institution of state change in the work itself. And so when I got to the notes and I arrived at this idea of the clearing, I knew it was a space of not only indeterminacy, but a kind of radical indeterminacy. So thinking about the ways in which we all live and work in the moment of indeterminacy and instability, we still persist in this making. And thinking about these moments of the clearing and the making and the improvisation, it was very important to me, you can see, to create paintings that were about fielding and about creating space that was a deep experience of subjectivity and a deep space of objectivity, where both the landscape, the plantation, the ocean was subject. In my relationship to that, in this sort of deep subjective way, could be tangled up a bit more. And then that tangling came from really the conversation between a didactic mark and an expressive surface. Sorry, going the wrong way. So what I did, I began to build up the surface, both with the graphite and the acrylic. So these encounters created a space of atmosphere, but they also created these moments of architecture. They also created a moment where I can lay sound or a note down. Right? So what happened is, what also began to sort of leap in these paintings is the yellow that came back. So where am I in my practice now, in the painting in particular, and then I'll go on to the larger sculptures and constructions. It's where this amalgamation happens. We're opening the possibility of state change, acknowledging the state change of climate and all the catastrophes that we survive, adapt to, adjust to. Also looking inside of that for something like the blues, looking inside of that for something like a note where these encounters don't relieve tension, but create more tension, and in that tension, we somehow find something beautiful. So part of my practice, I do a lot of scuba diving and thinking about ocean as a space of witness. Often what I grapple with in the work is the relationship between, or a question of distance and a question of depth. Like, what's the difference when I'm witnessing distance and when I'm witnessing depth? So in the paintings, I'm interested in that question of scale and a kind of grappling with the answer that came to me. When I'm working underwater, distance comes up when I think about ancestorship, and depth comes up when I think about my lungs as flotation devices. And that relational condition, I think, leads itself into these moments in the drawing where I both want to be free and I want freedom from my ancestors as I make this work and as I make these dives, and I place myself in oceans and rivers and quarries that have a big part of my belonging and my identity as a Black woman, especially growing up on the east side of Chicago, being born in the lake almost. So what happens in these moments where the horizon, the edge of the water in the lake, the drowning, the diving, the surviving, I think about, this idea of the deluge, right? Always falling, always dripping, always wet. And to think about, like, how did I get to a place where I live in the drenched? And I want to note that the poems are from a text that I've been working called The Dark Plunge. So I want to give a little bit of information on that. So this dark plunge, of course, came as I'm leaving the boats and getting into these large bodies of water and thinking about time and space, but also thinking about sound and how sound and light travel different underwater when you're thinking about the transatlantic slave trade. So I find myself committed to both this practice of finding instability. So I'm finding instability and tension and beauty and instability, and trying to make marks inside of this instability and instead of trying to stabilize my condition. So I want to read this piece about what it means to constantly be under and find structure inside of instability, and the water in particular. This piece is called Away. And this is a sort of a personal story. I was diving, I was in my 20s, and some woman came up to me and was like in an art residency and kind of was feeling my vibe and was saying, you're always down there somewhere. You should come up from down there. So maybe 20 years later, I wrote this piece. Come up from below, she said. You are down there hiding, she said. The water you love will fill your lungs and carry you away. I am already away. I am of the away. I am of impossible distance, of triangles and waves, of wakes and bones. From here to there, I rumble echoing the unknown of us, the below of us, who live in currents and clouds, of liquid and vapor, vapor to ice, a sublimation. I was born drenched and swarming, of wild hurricanes trying to call my name, a lens. And what of below? What of these waters? The greatest moving mass, the shape of vectors in war. I am not hiding, and I am not alone. I am here with the seekers in ocular magic, with light that drives me to love. There is no above. It's all under and gaping. It may look like drowning to you, but these paintings must rain for liquid ghosts and explosions, a deluge. Okay. So as I think about state change in my practice, I've begun to think about the relationship between ground, state change, formations, water meeting architecture, architecture meeting structure, structure meeting memory, and the focus, the attention that happens when these memories of these histories sort of collapse on to each other. So bringing the Bird and Lava series from painting to something between an object and a drawing, I was listening to myself and thinking about the pouring of the water. So I challenged myself then to liquefy graphite and use it to pour as well. So I began creating the solution from graphite and gel medium and pouring it on these surfaces that I built in relationship to memories between my home, between, I'll say, different historical architectural spaces, from Elmina to the south side of Chicago's very important history of architecture myself, the Country Club, and all of these shapes between the catastrophe of the slave trade to the quotidian of a Southside Country Club, to slaveholders, to ships. The curvilinear structure has also sort of reigned in my work as some place to look through and focus and look beyond. So these curvilinear moments also create these throughways. And one thing Toni Morrison also talks about, like, what is the madness? Like, what is the violence? And sometimes there's a throughway of madness when you're enclosed in such violence, right? You go towards madness instead of something like death. So these works are between a sort of madness, a life, ongoing, a focus, a sort of global catastrophe of architectures of enclosures. So thinking about the ways in which this tension between what does it mean to be in flux of world building and what does it mean to be in flux of liquidity, and using these world building devices and turning oceans into superhighways. And thinking, let me go back, and this is about 14 inches by 12 inches, around there. This is 8 feet across, and I think it's about 8 feet tall as well. This is graphite on wood. This piece is called Cotton. And one of the things that, where I enter most of my environmental catastrophes in labor and the abstraction of labor in relationship to industry is, of course, the cotton plantation, and the cotton plantation that leads us to a plantational scene, right, where the body is material and the labor is invisible. And thinking about cotton as an object between painting, drawing, and sculpture. It sits on the wall in this sort of division, and thinking about how do we force as people of enclosure state change, and how do we force a rupture in the systemic degradation? Well, the answer is systemic liberation. So thinking about the force of systemic liberation inside these conditions of enclosures. So what you see is a sort of both a landscape and an image, an infrastructure and a beginning, and these sort of collapses that happen all around. I'm not sure how much time I have. Okay, I'll just keep going until somebody tells me to stop. All right. So one of the things about my work is oftentimes I will respond to a narrative directly. Other things are more phenomenological, spiritual, around practicing these philosophical ideas that I have. But this particular work is from a project called Blackwater 1919, where a young man was murdered in Lake Michigan. And he and his friends were swimming in the lake. In this segregated lake, where a part of the lake was black and a part of the lake was white, and the two would not meet in between. But this interstitial space between became like a non-zone, right? And what was so interesting about these boys, these young, beautiful boys, finding this interstitial space, this liminal space between the black and the white space, was that they, to visit the space and revisit the space, they needed to build an infrastructure that would, host their play. So Eugene and his friends end up building this raft that would then really inspire the series. So the death of Eugene, that spectacle brought me to the story, but what kept me in the story was this idea of this raft that had to hold both the ties of Lake Michigan, the days of the young men leaving and coming back and returning, and what does it mean to be a sort of quotidian engineer that facilitates both play but an object of adaptation. So thinking about climate adaptation and the violence of racism really plunged me into thinking about the possibility of what does it mean to have engineers that are solely working towards environmental justice. So, and thinking about, I think this slide, I've made a mistake in my slides. Okay, so hopefully I have more of the 1919 images in this slide. But you know what I did? I thought about that perception and sightline. So that's why I included the next group. So I'll move from 1919 paintings about engineering to a different conversations around engineering and levees. So thinking about what Eugene and his friends went through, and thinking about how borders are built and how those borders are never enough to hold people back, whether it's a wall, whether it's a fence, whether it's a gate, they always fail. And what I'm interested is in people sort of overcoming these borders and engineering around them in this sort of hyper-focused, mindful way. So I started building these paintings that were, and I call them constructions, because the two-dimensional face then moves into a three-dimensional space. And this diagrammatic line that's in my work, and constantly my work, becomes about this sort of focus, and focus in, and moving across and through boundaries. So you have these moments where I add to the painting these sort of leaps, and that I call them leaps, that I simply draw around these new borders on top of the two-dimensional surface. And this is what I mean by a sort of systemic liberation. That violence, of course, happens at all speeds, and so does liberation. It's not always a spectacle. So I'm interested in this sort of movement, in the way in which perceptions, and Black people in particular, move across space and boundaries, and how this collective movement across space and boundaries and distance has an energy of itself. Right. So in that movement, in that climate, what I've begun to think about is this language of shapes that I'll talk about as hypershapes. Right? So these, I'm going to go back one. So these diagrammatic lines, crossing, moving over borders, I began to really liquefy them. So this is gouache on paper. And thinking about what does it mean to overlay, move through, deny, refuse, and in that, almost take flight. So the hypershapes were a way in which I could think about how flight happens. So after I thought about this sort of idea and this principle in my practice, I then put a limitation on myself to sort of work it out as a exercise, right? So how do I then exercise systemic liberation in my drawings, in my studios? And we're talking about clearings, we're talking about plantations, we're talking about projects, we're talking about oceans, we're talking about levees, all of these spaces that are simultaneously being navigated while unkeeping and dispossession is constantly happening, right? So in this space of constant movement, I wanted to create a discipline in the studio that was about state change, that was about movement inside of infrastructures and architectures of dispossession. So the hypershapes became hyper because of the ways in which they were deployed in the studio. So I'd give myself 60 seconds to make a mark. So I stack the papers up. These are 9 by 12, and I stack the packs up and just make a mark with the gouache and a large brush or a small brush. I'd spread them out in the studio. I'd let them dry, and I'd stack them again, and give myself another minute to make these diagrammatic lines. And eventually, they became a set, right? They became a system, an idiosyncratic language that then I would focus on. These hypershapes had the throughways. They had the systemic liberation of self-liberators. They had a discipline or a sort of cognitive reach in the studio to both focus and allow myself a space of radical indeterminacy. So the hypershapes began to sort of guide my practice and my form, thinking about them as these structures that then would lead my practice. So I would think about the hypershapes in my studio, so before the hypershapes and after the hypershapes, right? So the hypershapes allowed me into a world of construction inside the work that had it and infused in it, I think, as a condition of liberatory principles. So I sort of took off with ideas of construction, and then sort of sculpture became real to me. Before hypershapes, I did not consider sculpture or really architectural moments as anything interesting in my making that would move towards these logics. But the hypershapes sort of opened a door for me, a permission towards these logics. Right? So the hypershapes, these tests are graphite on panel. And I began to think about them as two-dimensional spaces and draw these three-dimensional spaces or illusions. And that space between middle ground, foreground, and background really became evident. But what also became evident in the work is this idea of transparency, right? So I started bringing glass into the work in these sort of small moments where I could think about what does it mean to exist in this opaque on purpose, and what does it mean to exist in these moments of visibility. So opacity and visibility is a condition of state change. Absolutely, I think just like the hypershapes. This is about 5x4 graphite and pen on wood. So the drawings, the drawings in relationship to the hypershapes. So what I started doing was thinking about the hulls of ships, the throughways of plantation architecture, my own experience living on plantations in college, ex-plantations on a college campus, levees, locks, docks, and essentially the infrastructure of liquidity, the infrastructures of water. And I realized that I could not only imagine new kinds of infrastructures inside of infrastructures of dispossession, because this is the world, right? We unkeep. So I started unkeeping buildings, I started unkeeping landscapes, I started unkeeping dungeons, I started unkeeping prisons. All that I could recall of these structures of enclosures, I started unkeeping them and taking them apart. So these drawings would then become sculptures. And I thought about this as these drawings for sculptures, right? So this is graphite and charcoal and pen. So recently I made a piece in New York titled Liquid Belonging. And what I didn't realize at the time was how I could make these hypershape conditions include energies of cities and towns, thinking about geographies of both African American dispossession and Native American, specifically on this site, the Lenape, and thinking about how atmospheric prayer is, and how ancestorship sort of moves between these spaces. So these throughways became critical to my work, and work that would then reflect both the sky and the wind and create a condition of deep presence, but also create a space. So public work or work outside, for me, is an extension of the paintings and the drawings, but definitely a complex space for both meditation and play. My challenge to myself was to create an environment that could host the hypershapes, but also make a choice, not have to make a choice between drawing, painting, sculpture, and architecture. Could I make a thing where people could come and feel like they could be quiet, scream, yell, sing, read, but also contemplate different kind of spatial conditions? So my goal was to make a space where state change could happen, right? My sort of prayer towards a clearing, and thinking about both the blue of the oceans and the yellows of my meditations, bringing them in, and also create a painting. So you would enter a painting, and then you would leave a painting and enter an architecture. You would leave an architecture and enter sculpture. You would leave a sculpture and enter a drawing. And then all of these things, as you transverse the work, would become one. So now I'm in construction, right? And I'm thinking about ways in which to build out the paintings, the drawings, and I start this collage work. So I'm going to read one last piece, and then I'll finish up for the day. Let me go through this a little bit fast. Sorry. Okay. To paint is to live in the distance. It's an environment of ongoing light, a spacious uncertainty, a visceral moment. I am not calm. Painting is a life of refusal. Each precarious mark, a liberation from ocular brutality, from the claws of racial capitalism in the air of unrelenting brutality. But these washes make space for you, for your beauty, monuments of state change and liquid, the before and the future, the liminal space inside discontinuous being. I love you. I sight you. I see your black face, a huge beauty. I am painting to be by your side. In the action of distillation, the spaciousness is for you. Today, my hands may be dust, but you are still looking. An exchange of dark power, a deep fidelity, way over there inside this painting, we will live forever.